Hey folks, welcome to the show. It's the Toronto Maple Leafs versus the Boston Bruins round one review. Kind of talk about how it went down. It was pretty predictable, I would say, and maybe that's easy for me to say because I was right about it in my bracket. I had Bruins in 7. I'm not happy that the Bruins won, and I wouldn't have been happy if the Leafs won. I'm just happy I was right. I actually didn't really care between the two teams. I've made my Toronto jokes before. I think they're overdone at this point. I've made my Boston jokes before. They're not necessary at this point either. I just wanted a good series and for it to end in a really funny way, which which it did. So I was happy. I know not everyone was happy, and let's talk about it. We'll talk about the series. I want to talk a little bit about what Steve Dangle said, from what I can recall in his Leaf game review of that final game 7. I'm not going to talk about all because I agreed with it all. It's just there's a few points he made that I would like to add a little note on. But how the series went down. Game 1, Boston thrashes Toronto. They win 5-1 in Boston, despite Toronto outshooting them. And Swayman was the net for that game. Allmark takes the net for game 2. Allmark has a good game. I don't want people to say, oh, they lost because they put in Allmark. No, he had a good game. But he didn't have a great game like Swayman would eventually have. And Boston did get outplayed by Toronto once again. And this time it favors Toronto, who wins 3-2. So it's clear from those two games that Boston will be winning through Jeremy Swayman, which would absolutely be the case as it gets down to the last few games. Game 3, Boston wins in Toronto. And then they win in Toronto again for Game 4, winning 4-2 in Game 3 and 3-1 in Game 4. Shots were pretty close in both of those. Game 5. Well, I should say, so at this point it's 3-1. And at this point, I'm thinking it's going to happen. The funny is going to happen. One of the funnies is going to happen, which I'll get to. So, and Steve Dangle explains in this video is that he's seen this before. Boston fans have seen this before. They've seen Boston go up 3-1, and they lost last year. Still to the Panthers. Whereas Toronto's seen this before. They've seen them be down to Boston 3-1 before, make a comeback and lose in Game 7. And Steve Dangle was right about that part. That last part is, well, he was right about it both, but he was right about suggesting that Boston will win in 7 despite having a 3-1 lead at this point. And we'll get there, because first it takes a Matthew Nyes OT winner to make it 3-2. Boston was very close to finishing the series in 5, but Toronto wins in OT 2-1. In Boston, Toronto wins again in Toronto. Toronto doesn't win a lot in Toronto in playoff games, but they did this time. It's another 2-1 final. During those two games, Jeremy Swayman played amazing, but Joseph Wall played even better. He was amazing. And then it's revealed he's injured himself. Steve Dangle talked a lot about that. So I'm not going to talk too much. But I am going to say that if Leafs fans are mad at him for injuring himself, because the belief is that on the final goal in Game 6, so Boston scores with less than a second remaining in Game 6 to make it 2-1. So pretty meaningless goal. And Joseph Wall tried very hard to make the stop. And he didn't make the stop, and there is lots of belief and analysis, no confirmations as of yet, but there is lots of belief that Wool injured himself there. And I think they're right. We'll see what the confirmation is, but I think they're right. That is where Wool saved it. And I've seen a lot of Toronto fans and non-Toronto fans say, well, Wool shouldn't have done it. He shouldn't have overextended himself on a meaningless shot. They're wrong. No, he should have. He should have. Absolutely. Because if you have a goalie thinking about, oh, this shot is meaningless, that's not a mindset you want your goalie to have ever. If you want to win, your goalie should think every shot is meaningful and be obsessed with getting that shot out when he could. So if Wool wouldn't have been the kind of goalie he is if he felt like, oh, I don't need to make that save. No goalie in the NHL is like that. And if a goalie is like that, they suck. Plain and simple. So I really don't like that talking point. about, well, Wool shouldn't have done that then. Yes, he should have. He should have tried. Hopefully when he normally does that, he doesn't injure himself. But if you have a goalie thinking, I don't want to injure myself on this shot, you're not winning that game. Anyways, Game 7. It's another 2-1 final, but this time it's Boston winning in another close game, another low-scoring game. Of course, there was some refereeing controversy. Of course, it had to go to OT, and of course, Boston won Game 7. Once Toronto won Game 6, I was quite happy because I was like, either way this ends is funny to me. If Toronto loses again to Boston, that's funny to me. If Boston loses in a 3-1 after being up 3-1 in a series for the second straight time in a row, that's funny to me. So I didn't really have a side, but I'll admit I kind of felt bad for a lot of Toronto fans. There's a lot of good of them. There's a lot of Toronto fans who deserve all the jokes, but there's a lot of good ones who get piled in there and joked about who don't deserve it. Anyways, so breaking down the series and the numbers over here, there's lots here you can look at. If you're on a phone, I apologize, they're pretty small, but I will point out some that are really major. One is goal scoring. Boston didn't score a lot. They scored 2.57 goals per game during the series, which is, again, as bad as that is pretty dang good compared to Toronto's 1.71. And I forgot to mention, Swayman was in for Game 3 and for the rest of the series. Ullmark only played one game, and again, he played good. I don't have an issue with him playing Ullmark, but it's one of those things where the right move is not the best move at the same time, if you get what I mean. Choosing Ullmark wasn't a bad decision. It just wasn't the best decision. Evidently. Hindsight's 2020. So anyways, Toronto could not score. That goes back for quite a while now. Toronto having an inability to score in the playoffs despite all the offensive prowess that they have. Despite the fact that Austin Matthews was a 69-goal scorer. And he wasn't playing all the time. That's true. And he did have a really good game too. And he did have an assist in Game 7. But Pasternak didn't have a great series either, but he did have the most important goal of the series, so I'm sure he's happy about the series, I mean. And so that's been a talking point, and as it should be. It absolutely should be a talking point that Toronto couldn't muster up 2 goals per game. They couldn't muster up 14 goals in a 7-game series when they have Matthews, Marner, Nylander, and Tavares, and Morgan Rielly. Absolutely should be. But it is important to note that Jeremy Swayman was amazing. Like, it's not like they were playing an average goalie. Boston's defense could have been better, but was good. But Jeremy Swayman was amazing. So that should be of note. And Toronto did manage to have some high danger chances at 8.29 per game, which I would say is above average, outpacing Boston's 6.43. But here's another major difference, which again comes down to goaltending, is high danger shooting percentage. Boston actually had more high danger goals for than Toronto did, despite having a lot less chances, because they shot at a 20% rate in high danger situations, which is pretty good compared to Toronto's 13.8, which is not good. And a lot of that has to do with not just perhaps not showing up in the big moments for Toronto Stars, but more importantly, Jeremy Swayman showing up in the biggest moments. And Toronto's goalies not so much, except for Joseph Woll. Samsonov had his games and also had games that he'll want to forget. Other important stats, Toronto, to their credit, hit a ton. Boston hit a ton too. There was a lot of hits this series. Toronto out-hit Boston and hit Boston 1.79 times per shot. Boston was able to get off. Boston's 1.56 per hit against 1.56 hits per shot against is a pretty good number, but Toronto's is even better. So credit to Toronto, they were very physical this series. That has been a knock on them in the past, and this is kind of where I said one step forward, one step backwards. Yeah, you got more hits out this time. Good for you. You had more snot, which is a word that's been thrown around, but it didn't get you any goals, really. which is evidently what you needed more. I think everybody would rather have a goal than a hit. Face-off percentage, Toronto did dominate here too. They won 56.2% of the face-offs. Good for them. Now, special teams is where it really went bad for Toronto. Toronto could have got more calls than they got, true, but they still got a lot more their way than Boston did. They had 21 power play opportunities in those 7 games. It's 3 per game. Boston had 17, a little lower. Boston, in their 17 power play opportunities, had 6 goals. How many do you think Toronto had in their 21? Without reading. Maybe you've already read. I tried covering it with my hands, but you can't really on my screen, but my screen isn't your screen, so that was a waste. But anyways, what you'd think would happen is Toronto would, they'd score quite a few. They scored 1 goal. They had 1 power play goal on their 21 opportunities. Not acceptable. Credit to Boston, too. I'm not saying that Boston should be discredited. They had a 95.2% penalty kill. That's doesn't happen just because Toronto sucks in the power play. It also happens because you're really good on the penalty kill, or Jeremy Swayman's really good, which he was. But you need to be better than 1 for 21. So that was really bad for Toronto. That was another area that killed them. Speaking of goalies and Jeremy Swayman, there was another talking point that I want to talk about that Dingle also talked about that's been thrown around, and it's one I don't really like either. So it came out in I forget with who. There was an interview, someone was interviewing Jeremy Swayman, and he talks about how he, and I should do a video on this too, a separate video, but there is a short answer that Steve Dangle did get into himself, and I'll repeat it here because it's worth repeating. They talk about how Jeremy Swayman interviewed with Toronto Maple Leafs before he was drafted, and he was quite convinced that he was going to get drafted by Toronto Maple Leafs. Obviously, he would have been a really good pick for them. He told his father, I think I'm going to be a Maple Leaf. And I said, okay. In the 4th round, Jeremy Swayman's still on the board, and Toronto has the pick. And they pick another goalie. I believe his name was Ian Scott. And Jeremy Swayman feels a little let down, but before he can dwell on those feelings, he is picked by Boston the very next pick. So there has been a talking point that Jeremy Swayman hates the Leafs. He hates the Leafs, and this is why he's showing them up and all, which is a partial truth, which is the most effective thing. Partial truth is more effective than a lie or a full truth. But I do believe Jeremy Swayman was using that moment as a reason for him to dominate the Maple Leafs this year, both in the regular season and in the playoffs. As a goalie, and I'm saying this as a goalie myself, you'll take any reason you can get to be better. I remember in my last floor hockey league, I hadn't been very good in the seasons before, and so I got made fun of for that, and they were just joking around. They're good guys. That bugged me over it. So I didn't hold any hard feelings against them personally. As a person, I wasn't hurt by it. I'm like, hey, those were fair jokes. I was sloppy. But as a goalie, I took it very personally. And I had my best year. We were the 2nd best team in the league. And I led the league in penalties by goalie because I was quite pissy. I had been taking lessons from, not personally from Mike Smith, but from watching him. Which, yeah, I did allow some really weird goals. But I was a lot better goalie as on a whole. And more penalties. Anyways, so I have no doubt that Jeremy Swayman used that instance for him. For his benefit, but I don't think Jeremy Swayman hates the Leafs, and I don't think he seems like a really positive guy, so I don't think he hates the Leafs. And as Dangle talked about, choosing Ian Scott is only bad in hindsight because he had a really good junior career, and he looked good in the one period of exhibition play he played for the Leafs. The reason he only played that one period was because he had to retire early due to injuries. The Leafs didn't know that. Nobody knew that. So that's not the Leafs' fault. It's just a freak accident that, of course, happened to Toronto's goaltending scenario, which, once again, benefits Jeremy Swayman and the Boston Bruins. Usually when Toronto fumbles a goalie, whether it's their fault or not, Bruins usually benefit. It just seems like in the last few years, looking at Andrew Raycroft and Tuukka Rask. But anyways, I just wanted to talk about that a bit. I do, again, so to recap about both Wall and Swayman. Wall, it was good for Wall to go and get that save, because even though he injured himself on that save, well, it was a goal against, it would have been a lot worse for his mentality and personality to say, I don't need to make that save. And two, Swayman doesn't hate the Leafs. Okay, well, maybe he does, but I haven't seen that. He just was, that was just a story that happened, and that I'm sure he used to make himself better. That happens a lot, even though if he doesn't hold Toronto responsible for that. Like, I don't hold those guys who made those jokes about me not being a good goalie against them. They were fair jokes. I was not a good goalie. I was bad. I would have said the same things in their position, but as a goalie, you take it differently. So that's what I want to talk about there. So now, going forward for Boston, they get to play the Florida Panthers again. Whoopee! I did a preview video about that already. As of right now, Boston is winning the series 1-0, which is something I did predict in my preview. And again, I am going to tout it when I win a prediction or I am right about something, because I was wrong about quite a bit in my bracket. But which is another video you can go watch. For Toronto going forward, well, that's a whole other video in and of itself that's been talked to death by so many different people. And I don't know. I don't think anybody knows what's right, because this is a good team. But as Steve Dangle said, it's not good enough. Changes are going to happen. It's likely that the core is going to have a replacement or move out or shrunk, whatever you want to say. I have my own opinions on that, on all that kind of stuff. But Toronto is a good team. You know, I'm not going to say, Toronto sucks, haha. No, they are a good team. They're a very talented team. There just is some issues with leadership, in my opinion. Steady and consistent goaltending, which hopefully Wall, for their sakes, can fix. And we'll see if a retool works. I would get a kick out of if Tree Living retooled them the same way he retooled the Calgary Flames, because it didn't end so well. But I'd also like to see some success for Toronto. I think it'd be kind of fun to watch Toronto win around more than once every 20 years. But it has been fun to see them win only once in 20 years or so. So either way, we'll see. All eyes on them, as always, which I'm sure kind of sucks. But speaking of eyes on somebody, please turn on notifications when you subscribe. Hopefully subscribe. Consider liking the video if you think I've earned it. And leave your thoughts down in the comment section below. It is Toronto and Boston. I'm sure you have your thoughts. Feel free to put them in the comment section below. I was going to say there are no dumb opinions, but there are. And I've talked about them on this channel. I've had my own too, so it's okay. I will see you when I see you next.